decades. And I even reported on one case in California where students were actually getting paid $1,400 a school year to participate in a social justice focused club on campus. And that money was coming from taxpayers through this nonprofit to the students. That type of influence that these nonprofits are gaining in public schools is not uncommon today.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Roosh, educator that is bringing viewpoint diversity to all things in the culture war, but really it's about education for me. That's my background and the way that we could do education better. And my guest today is a journalist with the Free Press, and the Free Press is really, I think, on the up and up for a lot of reasons. Started by Barry Weiss when she left the New York Times to bring viewpoint diversity and talk about things that aren't going to get picked up by a lot of the more legacy media organizations. And so I have Frannie Block here, and she is a reporter. She's used to be at the Des Moines Register, a more local paper, but now is working with the Free Press. And she recently wrote an article called How American Educators Are Conning Kids. And it dives into a bunch of things about lowering standards. And this is something that I've talked extensively about. I talked about it with Ian Rowe on the podcast and a bunch of other educators. And I think that it brings up a really, really important point about what's happening in education and how it's a problem. But also, I think we're going to dive into the culture wars and the way that culture wars are discussed in schools, because I think it's not done well. So I'm really excited to talk to you. Frannie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much
for the stuff that you're doing. Like writing these articles are really important, because for so long, I was screaming at the top of my lungs about what was happening in K through 12, and everyone was focusing on higher ed and focusing on the universities. And I was like, it's too late. By the time you get there, it's too late. This is what's happening. You got to go upstream from what's happening on the universities, because there's problems there. And it really happens very, very young in the school system. So just give us a little bit of a background on you as a journalist, and why you kind of chose to go down the road of, you talk about educational issues a lot, and thank you for doing that, because we don't get a lot of attention. So just a little bit of your background, and then how that, your interest in different topics and what to investigate and things led you into education as well.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting to hear you talking about how education isn't talked about enough. And I always find that so fascinating, because every time I put out an education piece in the Free Press, people are flocking to it. They're craving it. So even though people aren't reporting on this issue as much, they're not talking about it as much, this is an issue that so many Americans care so deeply about, because it impacts them so personally, their kids, their own education. This is a huge, huge topic. So on that note, I actually started covering education, kind of as you hinted to, by covering higher education. I was working on stories about what was going on with university investigative processes, administrative bloat in universities, how that was impacting kind of free expression, free speech, due process rights on campus. And that was my kind of first foray into covering education for the Free Press. Then October 7th happened, and kind of this eruption of campus activism, if you want to call it that, came along with it. And I started covering that. That's the higher education, that was the big story of the time. And so I was following that closely. But it wasn't actually until, I would say, a month or two after October 7th that I started to realize and understand that everything that's happening on college campuses, this isn't happening in a vacuum. Something is happening before students get to campus. And it's starting as early as pre-K. And that's when I actually published a story in the Free Press about anti-Semitism in K through 12 public education in America. Again, going all the way back to a pre-kindergarten class where a teacher was teaching kids how to identify people by their ethnicities, by their noses. And, all the way then up to high school, and the way that curriculum is being altered in this country to focus on teaching kids about the world through the lens of the oppressor and the oppressed, and how that ultimately leads to anti-Semitism, not just in K through 12, but later on in college and throughout the rest of our society. So that's kind of my story into covering education. And I'll touch too on the most recent article that you just brought up that I published about what's going on when it comes to test scores in America. And you're right, this all ties into the lowering of standards that we've seen across the board, also in higher education. But again, it's starting lower when kids are just young in kindergarten, elementary school, all the way up through high school. And what I found through my reporting is that there's something in America called the honesty gap. This is basically when states will administer their own tests, but they'll artificially kind of inflate the numbers by lowering what's called the cut score. So they'll make it essentially easier for kids to pass their tests in reading and math proficiency. But when you compare those state test scores to national test scores, which really haven't changed all that much since they started being administered about 30 years ago, you start to see this huge gap. Whereas in a state like, I'm making up these numbers because I can't remember them off the top of my head, but a state like Wisconsin, which recently lowered its cut scores, their state test score might say that 50% of fourth graders are reading on grade level. But if you look at the national score, the truth is it's actually only about 30%. And the point of that article was to bring up the fact that that's not actually good for kids. It's not good for parents either. Who is that good for? It's good for the politicians. And I want to emphasize with that story too. This is there's bipartisan grade inflation going on, you could say. It's happening in red states like Oklahoma. It's happening in blue states like New Jersey. And it really is happening across the board. And I think ultimately the core of why this is a problem is because it's hurting our kids and it's hurting our parents in America, but it's actually really there to serve administrators, serve politicians. That's why these changes are being implemented.
Yeah, you brought up a really good analogy. I work in analogies, metaphors all the time, uh, and you brought up like the issue of lowering these standards for lifeguards. Like, what would that
Mm.
look like? Well, then it would look like lifeguards who couldn't go out and save people. So it's not a kind thing to say like, all right, instead of you have to swim 100 yards in this amount of time, you stretch it out to be a longer time, or you need to tread water for 20 minutes and say you lower like you only need to tread water for 5 minutes. That's not going to be good for society. But you could say, well, look, our lifeguards are all passing with flying colors because the standards have been lowered so much. And I think there's a real disconnect in education between like the work you're doing will actually matter out in the world as opposed to the work you're doing is just to get a diploma. It's like this transactional thing as opposed to gaining skills that are actually good for you and society. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And I think too, when you bring up this kind of transactional nature of the test scores get a lot of hate in education spaces today, particularly from even the teachers unions that are saying, no, these aren't representative of children's learning, kind of ignore these. There's all these disparities. That means that these tests are racist, they're this, they're that, discount them. And I think what this problem shows is not that these test scores are useless. I think these test scores are actually super important. And so the problem is that if students and parents aren't being told the truth about where they're at. You brought up the lifeguard example. I think in the story, one of my sources, the former deputy director of the New Jersey Department of Education, he compared it to like if all of the kids are being told that they're great swimmers, but they're actually in the water drowning.
Yeah.
Like that's a really serious issue. They need to be told the truth. And as much hate as test scores get, these numbers tell us something important about where kids are at in America, where they need help, where they need extra support. And the best way to actually target problems is to first be truthful about where the problems lie.
Yeah, I mean, I understand it. Like, I've been in education for a long time. I started teaching full time in 2006. Like, there is like this thing going back, especially back then, of like an overemphasis on test scores because of No Child Left Behind and things like that. It's like, well, that doesn't really encapsulate like the brilliance of kids. I taught kids who were brilliant, but they didn't do well on tests. So,
Hmm.
so they're like, oh, so they're just a dumb kid. And there's a happy medium there. There's like a middle ground there to say
Absolutely.
like test scores are important, but they're not the end all be all. And instead, we kind of just like swing the other direction, like we do with so many things in society. We swing from one extreme to the other. And now, I mean, a lot of universities, they're not requiring SATs, they're not requiring ACTs. And then if so it's really on GPA and the essay. But then when you factor in the GPA, the grade inflation, the grade point average, like when you
Hmm.
create the inflation, now it's a lot on the essay. And that just falls more into that like that element of I don't know, like subjective experience. And that's
Hmm.
what's going to get you into college. But you can see the data, like just because you come from a hard background or something doesn't mean that you have the chops to keep up at a very difficult university. And it's actually not kind to let people into these universities and into these programs that are really rigorous if they don't have the ability to do it. Because then they get in and everyone's like, yay, you got into Yale or UCLA or whatever it is. And then they fail out because they just don't have the ability. And then they're really embarrassed. They have to go home and be like, I just couldn't hang. That's not kind. And that's something that I see over and over and over again.
I think what bothers me too about that argument, like let's get rid of the ACT, let's get rid of the SAT when it comes to college admissions, is so much of it is wrapped up in it's, disproportionately hurting students of color. It's disproportionately hurting students from lower socioeconomic statuses. But I actually think the truth is the opposite. When you think about what are the easiest parts of the college admission system to game, it's the
Yeah.
essays. You can pay people to help you with your essays, and in some cases, even write your essays. It's the grades. If you're at a school where, I don't know, you've got a parent that's calling your fancy private school every day to say, why isn't so and so getting an A on this test? And then the teacher's feeling the pressure to give you a better grade. Like, those types of things I feel like are much more subjective than these test scores, which actually I think show that students who are incredible, who are really smart and come from disadvantaged backgrounds, they can perform really, really well on these tests, and that can really help them
Yeah.
get into an amazing institution and help them on a path to, more prosperity in their future for them and their families. So I think that's what always bothers me is it's if we want to talk in education spaces about helping students from disadvantaged backgrounds, whatever that background may be, let's look at what actually helps those students. And I do think you're right. Test scores don't encompass everything. I was actually like a test anxious student, so I'm totally sympathetic to that. And I always hated it. I always felt like tests didn't fully represent me as a learner, as whatever. But at the end of the day, there are really important metrics still to understand where kids are at and where they're going to thrive.
Yeah, this whole concept of like kind of changing the metrics so that we can advertise things like especially politically. It's like, look, our kids are very proficient. I had a friend of mine who's a California highway patrolman. And I had him over for dinner, he and his wife, and I was asking him, like, why is it that we have these policies? Because he's really frustrated. He's like, I arrest these people and they're back out on the street the next day. He's like
Hmm.
really frustrated with the way that crime is being handled, like here in Los Angeles. And I was like, why is that? Like, why would they do that? Why would they say, like, yeah, you can just steal stuff and we're not going to prosecute, as long as it's below like the $950 threshold and things. And what he said was, he's like, well, they can say crime is down because look at the data. If you don't actually arrest people, then crime is down. So he's like, if they're not spending time in jail, then, incarceration is down. But he's like, it's just people getting away with crimes. I was like, oh my gosh, that's so nasty, but I get it. I get it from a political
Totally.
standpoint. And there's a lot of overlap there between that and what I read in your article.
Yeah, I'll even bring it to the other side. It's like during COVID when Trump said, if we just stop COVID testing people, we'll have fewer people that have COVID. It's across the board. That tactic
Yeah.
is deployed in so many different ways. And I do think, something that you and I both work towards and what we're pursuing now is the truth, right? Like let's find the truth, whether it's inconvenient on either side, I don't care where it lies. What's best for kids? What's best for kids from disadvantaged backgrounds? What's going to best educate America's children?
Yeah, 100%. Like, two things that you mentioned of like, well, let me ask you, like, why do you think that when you actually honestly look at it, kids are less literate, they're worse in math than they were, and you give some data like worse than they were in 2012, worse than they were in 1990. Like, it's odd because we have all of these awesome, Duolingo type stuff and gamifying and apps, and we should be getting better in education every year because we have more technology, we have a lot more information about what works and what doesn't, and maybe we should use more phonics than whole word or whatever. Like we have all this stuff, and yet it's going down and down and down. You mentioned cell phones. That's something that Jonathan Haidt, I worked with John Haidt at Heterodox Academy for a while, and that's something that's like his like soapbox issue right now is like getting cell phones out of schools. And then the other one is lockdowns, which is something that the teachers unions really push for, are these lockdowns. And I was
Mhm.
a teacher during COVID, and it was really difficult. And the mental health aspects of it, but also there just wasn't a lot of learning going on. I got a lot of the camera just pointed up at the ceiling, or kids who didn't have good Wi-Fi at their home, the kids who were embarrassed about what their house looked like, so they would
Mhm.
so they wouldn't want to turn their cameras on. And then there just wasn't a lot of accountability across the board at my school, at my friends who were teaching in different kinds of school environments. Those are two things I absolutely think contributed to it. But what else do you think is the reason why our kids are just, lack of a better term, they're just dumber than they were before, and that's the wrong term to
Yeah.
use. But like they're just not as
I've read
educated.
articles that say
Yeah.
that flat out. People are saying that now. So
Yeah.
it's a really unfortunate reality. I think it's interesting whenever I ask sources who are really high up in education spaces, who've been studying education, who've worked in education for decades, these questions. Why are kids not able to read today when they could 15 years ago? They just clam up. They're like, "Oh, we don't know. There's a bunch of factors. That's the big question. Nobody really knows the answer." I always find that really startling that everybody knows that this is a problem, but it seems like nobody really knows the answer. Obviously, Jonathan Haidt, he's a great example of somebody who's identified a very serious problem. And I do think it is a very serious problem. I've interviewed many teachers, and you probably experienced this too, Will, who said that their kids, like literally, when they have to put their phones away, they'll cry. They
Oh,
cannot survive without their phones. And I even feel that myself as an adult. Like it's a problem. It hurts my productivity. I cannot imagine being a middle schooler, for example, and being asked to pay attention in class and disconnect from my phone when kids have literally been born now with phones right in front of their
yeah.
faces. So I do think that's a really serious issue. I also think that, as you mentioned, kind of phonics, whole word reading, I think that has really hurt America's kids. If you've listened to the Sold a Story podcast, which I think goes through this really, really well, kind of the transition away from phonics has made it such that kids who are struggling to read are struggling even more so because they're not learning to actually identify how to read. They're just kind of learning to guess. I think you're seeing that reflected in reading scores today. Yes, math scores are going down, but reading scores are really where I think the biggest concerns are in the country right now. Those are the scores that are as low, if not lower, than they were 30 years ago. And what's super important to note about those scores is that for the kids that are in the lowest percentiles, their scores are far lower than they were 30 years ago versus the kids that are in the highest percentiles, their scores are far higher. So you're seeing this really massive achievement gap. And it's just continually hurting the kids who are struggling the most. And that's not what the education system should be doing either. So,
No. Yeah.
o- on that note, like other problems that I've heard from teachers, they've talked about, um, frankly, a pressure that they felt in the classroom to just pass kids along. That's something I've been speaking to teachers about recently, thinking about also working on another kind of bigger profile story about that for the Free Press, because so many teachers are telling me that if they fail kids because kids aren't learning or kids don't know the material or they're not studying or they're not paying attention, the teacher gets in trouble from their administration. And if they just pass the kid along, then that saves the teacher a headache. And I think that's also a really big issue, leading to why so many kids are I've seen so many stories. I even wrote one myself about kids graduating high school and not being able to read.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, they can't read their diploma. I mean, I think that there's an element too. I'm curious if you see this of like toxic compassion. Like we teachers, we're like a
Totally.
soft-hearted lot, like, oh, you poor thing. And there's so, especially for like a marginalized community or something like that, like it'll be so detrimental to them if they fail. Oh, you poor thing. Oh, you had a tough morning. Don't worry about it. Let's just talk about your feelings. And I think that again, like that was not the way it was a generation or two ago. So the pendulum swung so far in the other directions. So there's seems to be a resurgence in like classical education, like sit down in rows, do this, do the work, like that kind of stuff, because that is what's going to equip them for the future. Like, talk about your feelings and overemphasis on self-esteem and boosting your self-esteem. Like, I'm not saying that that's not good, but at what point are we going to be focused more on that than more on getting them the skills that they need to be able to go do things? Like within this lowering standards, a big thing that's lowered as far as standards go is behavior standards. I mean, like
Totally.
not getting kids in trouble for showing up late. You can't go to McDonald's and work at McDonald's and show up late. So that's not even like the way that the school system was created by the Rockefellers and the Prussian model and everything about like building compliant workers. Even it's failing even at that. If they can't read, they can't respond to an email. Okay, then you can't work front desk at an office or something like that, and then you show up late and the behavior standards of like, kids who are being super disrespectful to their teachers and they just don't get in trouble because we don't want to expel kids because they're from a tough background. All this like toxic compassion stuff, that's not what these kids need. And then they're going to go out into the world and they're going to be ill equipped. They're not, a boss isn't going to stand for that. So it's like a fake world in these schools that's just like, oh, you poor thing, you poor thing, you poor thing. But if you're running a business, you can't just be like, oh, you poor thing. It's like, no, you're not doing the job, you're out. And then these kids are going to be unemployable. Like that's something that I'm concerned about.
Totally. I mean, I think what you're bringing up too is it's restorative justice in the school disciplinary setting. And I remember back in December 2023, in one of the stories I wrote about a teacher in New York City who her students were actively like bullying her, anti-Semitic bullying against this Jewish teacher in a New York City public school. And the way she describes how the administration dealt with it is that they literally sat all of the kids down with the teacher for a feeling circle, where the students sat in a circle and expressed how much they hated the teacher for like half an hour, and that was their punishment. And then they, went on their way, and that was it. And I do think that, how are kids supposed to learn in an environment in which they can kind of never do any wrong? The other thing you raised, Will, that I think is super interesting too, is that I've had many different teachers talk to me also about how their job as a teacher, the role has kind of expanded. It's no longer, I'm responsible for teaching students reading and math. It's also now morphed into, I'm their therapist. I'm kind of supposed to be their social justice warrior kind of teacher. I'm supposed to teach them how to get in touch with their self-esteem and teach them this and teach them that about, whatever you think about social emotional learning, DEI, whether you think it belongs in schools or not, that is kind of added to the workload of the everyday teacher who now has less time to teach about math and less time to teach about reading. And a lot of teachers have expressed to me that they think that's also contributing to what's going wrong in public schools, that they just don't have enough time in the day to do all the things they're now tasked with doing.
Yeah, there's an opportunity cost to covering that. Like, oh, I have to do this too. Then there's only so many hours in the day that you have access to these kids, that you have access to your classroom. So as you bring in more of that stuff, then something else has got to go. I mean, that's just the way it is. It's like basic economics. You
Exactly.
so yeah, so the reason I got into like the social media podcasting world is because these stories came up in like 2016, 2017. It was Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein and Nicholas Christakis, and basically like woke, for lack of a better term, stuff coming up on campuses. And these kids were like indoctrinated into this way of thinking. From where though? Like there was so much focus, Joe Rogan's podcast and all these big podcasts were talking about, what was happening on college campuses. And then Heterodox Academy was like, let's bring viewpoint diversity into college campuses. And I just was like, you guys don't get it. Like they don't just walk in as clean slates at 18 or 19 years old to these campuses. They are already adopting into this. And Heterodox Academy, when they started the K through 12 program, which I was, the head of, like there was like this like push of let's start viewpoint diversity young, but then after a couple of years, they got rid of the K through 12 program and they just focused again on higher ed. And I ran into John Haidt. We were at like a conference and I ran into him at the gym and I was like, John, what's going on? He's like, I know, Will, I know, but they want to go more in this direction. I was like, it's too late. You can't just do this. You can't have a kid, be told that this is the way to think. There's only one way to think when it comes to this issue. This is the way to think. This is the way to think. This is the way to think. For, maybe from middle school or even earlier, you're reading Ibram Kendi, like Anti-Racist Baby or something like that, all the way up. And it might be on its nose, like it might be that blatant, or it might be a little bit more surreptitious. It might just be, that the natural inherent bias that these teachers have will just seep through in certain ways. That as a writer, like word choice, like that'll guide you down a certain pathway that by the time you get to college, now you have to undo that kind of thinking and then rebuild, as opposed to just building them up with critical thinking from the jump. And I think that's an issue. And that's why I'm so glad that it's getting more attention. You say that like, there's a lot of attention that your articles get about education, but it's rarely talked about on big podcasts and on big like legacy media forums when it comes to the stuff you're talking about, like the
Yeah.
way that we have to do this better.
Well, I think one aspect of my reporting we haven't talked about yet is reporting on the ways that kind of these social justice organizations have become official partners of public education of public schools, basically. And I reported on a couple different examples of this where, very, very kind of politically left wing nonprofits are getting sometimes $1 million government contracts to work with kids. And I even reported on one case in California where students were actually getting paid $1,400. I think, yeah, they were getting paid $1,400 a school year to participate in a social justice focused club on campus. And that money was coming from taxpayers through this nonprofit to the students. And that's not necessarily that arrangement. That arrangement's pretty extreme, but that type of influence that these nonprofits are gaining in public schools is not uncommon today. And I think that's a big, if you think about what's a big change that's happened in public education in the last 5 to 10 years, that's a big one, is the influence of these nonprofits. I also think then you also see how these nonprofits are influencing the way teachers teach or the way teachers conceptualize their jobs. And I do think there's also been a shift where teachers, again, are not thinking about math and reading and those basics. They're also thinking about kind of using their role as a teacher to be an activist for social change. And that seeped into their approach to teaching students not how to think about complex issues, but what to think about complex issues. It's erased the nuance in American schools.
Yeah. And so what's the solution? I've been watching this stuff for a while publicly. I've been living it, teaching at various schools. And it's like, what's the solution? What's the change that you want to see? So that's why I started Patterdocs, which is my online education platform, because I was like, I want to change this in education. So I'm going to throw my hat into the ring. So it's working with individual families who might homeschool because parents are pulling their kids out after COVID. They're like, this is nuts. So working with them
Yep.
to bring viewpoint diversity and critical thinking, but also doing PD, doing professional development. But it's interesting because a lot of schools don't see the problem that you and I see so clearly. Like critical thinking. No, that's not like, no, we need PD on, like you said, the social like the on the like mindset and anxiety and stuff. And I think that's important, but I think that the idea of, can you hear ideas and wrestle with them and understand that there's legitimate reasons why our country is divided. Like if there's an issue that's controversial, take any big controversial issue, immigration, guns, abortion, whatever it is. If we're almost 50-50 split down this country, then there's
Mhm.
brilliant people on both sides. You can't just blindly dismiss that all of the people over here are ignorant or immoral. Like that's not going to get us through this. And teachers don't want to touch, administrators don't want to touch those third rail topics. And those are the topics that I think are really important, because if you ask educators all around the country, do you do critical thinking? They're like, yes, absolutely. Well, what about when it comes to transgender kids? It's like, well, no, we're not going to discuss that. But like,
Mhm.
that's what's being discussed in the world. That's what's being discussed in this country. What about when it comes to race issues or anti-Semitism issues or Israel issues? Like these are the ones that actually matter to people. And there's so much fear involved, as we saw, during like the George Floyd kind of summer, of people just being scared to push back in any kind of way. And teachers, they're not equipped to be able to highlight the perspectives of different people. And so that's something that I'm working on getting into more schools. But like the amount of like pushback that I get is startling, because they just don't think it's a problem, or they're scared to even go into it. So you just avoid it. And we're not going to get any better on
Mhm.
how to communicate about these issues if we're just going to keep avoiding them. So what do you think is the solution?
I mean, it's so great to know that there are people like you who are actively trying to kind of bring those principles back into the classroom. I think one of the solutions I see is actually not necessarily in the classroom with the teacher and the younger students. It's actually in the teacher colleges and in the teachers' classrooms where the teachers are learning to become teachers. And I think that we need a recommitment to, again, the idea that teaching is not to teach students what to think. It's not to impart your worldview onto your students. It is to equip your students with the tools and the toolkit to deal with, think about, and grapple with a complicated, messy world. And I think that reframing can kind of transform American education back to its kind of former greatness. So that's one thing I think about. And I do think that that also just comes back to great teachers. I really do. I wrote one of my favorite stories I've done because I'm often reporting on the problems, I'll be honest. But one of my favorite stories I did do was actually about a college course. So this isn't quite K through 12 focused, but it was about a professor at Princeton, which is my alma mater, who was teaching a class about American greatness. And I know that that sounds like, okay, sure, fine. It became the most popular class at Princeton. And I thought that was so cool because you hear so much about how young kids today, they hate America, they hate everything that's going on in the West and death to America in some extreme cases you hear them chanting. And
Yes.
here were all of these kids that wanted to learn about great figures from American history. And I think part of that is can be attributed to the fact that this teacher one is super charismatic, but two, he was just willing to come out and say, hey, if you guys want to be great, which I know a lot of you guys want to be great people, here are some people you can learn from. And I think that following the model and example of teachers, professors like that who have a genuine love for the topic area and who want to teach their kids how to be critical thinkers, that's the place to start.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you get in though? I mean, I don't know. Like you working for the Free Press, are you I had a friend who wrote for Quillette for a little bit
Hmm.
and um like like from like a wealthy like old money kind of background up in New England and stuff. And then when he was at like a dinner party or something, people would just look down their noses. They're like, "Oh, you don't work for the Times" or something along those lines, you know? Like is there is it like you're a pariah for talking about this stuff? Because I think getting into the colleges of education, I agree with you, but how do you even get your foot in the door? Like that's the
Hmm.
tricky thing. Like how do you get in? Because I'm guessing that there's a lot of people that'll look at the Free Press maybe and see your article and just be like and just instantly dismissive of it. I mean, I don't know. Do you experience that? Like that because you're pushing it back against what like the more legacy media companies are covering. And I don't know how to shift that mindset. I agree. I think that, going in and talking about the moral foundations theory and things like that to colleges of education would be something that I've done before. And I would love to do that more at colleges of education, but getting in, there's just such a wall that if I wanted to get in and talk about if I was whatever a dreadlocked lesbian, it probably would be easier if I wanted to get in and talk about systemic racism. It's right in, and I have friends who do that. They like kind of play that game. But for me to get in there and talk about the importance of viewpoint diversity and freedom of speech is like, oh, like it's just it's really difficult. How do you break down those doors?
It is really difficult. I won't deny that. I will say, there's always going to be people that are going to see an article and see that it's in the Free Press and not the New York Times and dismiss it because of that. That will probably always exist to some extent or another. On the flip side, though, I think you're also seeing more and more people, for better or for worse, seeing an article from the New York Times and dismissing it just because it's from the New York Times.
I know.
So I do think that
There's a
right
shift
now we're
happening.
in an I think there's a shift, the vibe shift. We're in an era also of building of new institutions. The Free Press is in some ways a new institution, and it's opening back up that space where it's, hey, it's okay to talk about this and that. And I'll even bring an example of our newsletter today, not about education, but it was about Ukraine. We had like five different essays from five different commentators, all about different perspectives about Trump, Zelensky, and Ukraine and what's
Yeah.
going on there and what the US should do. That I think is coming back. And I will also say, there's top-down change, and that comes from administrators saying, you know what, we need to, for example, impose institutional neutrality again, get back to that idea of, what's a campus, what's a school environment supposed to be like. But there's also, I think, a bottom-up change happening. I'm technically a member of Gen Z, and I do think that we're seeing a big shift among Gen Z of people saying, you know what, I'm tired and I'm stressed about worrying about every word that I say and thinking this word could be the end of me. This could literally end my future career, my future life. That is such a weight for a young person to bear. And I think a lot of young people are really getting tired of that. And I think, in some spaces you're seeing, again, as everything goes, a shift to another extreme of like, I'm going to just say whatever I want. But I also think that you're seeing a growing consensus of young people saying, you know what? It's fun to debate. Or actually, it's
Yeah.
really intellectually stimulating. Or
Yeah.
I really like having my ideas challenged because now I understand better what I think. Like, that's a really empowering thing when you finally get that. And so I do think, not just these are not just the vibes I'm getting, but polls are even showing this, that I think young people are craving more of that free and open environment, and that I'm hoping will reflect in our big institutions.
Yeah. Yeah. And then just they have places to go that they can, like the free press, like, there's places to go where they feel like they're being represented. Like, okay, this is like more aligned with what I believe in. And then the marketplace of ideas, and the market, and like adding some of this to market forces, as far as like, um if there's a, University of Austin, which I was a teacher fellow for them,
Hmm.
and like if they just have like a new freshman class and it's small but it's growing, if more people go towards that, then other universities are going to go, oh, okay, well, I guess that's what people want, and then they'll start to adapt as well. When people start pulling away, people will support things or boycott things, with their pocketbook. They're gonna go to what they think is best. So maybe the ground up element is important as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's like good old-fashioned capitalism if you think
Hmm.
about it.
Yeah.
If people are craving this and you build the institutions and they come to it, all of a sudden the legacy institutions are going to look around and say, hey, maybe we actually need to make a shift and a change. You're seeing that in media. I mean, look at what's going on now with the Washington Post. There's huge changes going on there. And you're even seeing it in the way that papers like the New York Times are covering some really controversial issues. For example, I think on, um, you know, trans healthcare, for example,
Right.
the New
Saw
York
that one.
Times has had a big shift in how they've covered that topic compared to today, compared to, 5, 10 years ago. So I do think that those pressures from the new world of media, the new world of education, they also then start to influence the legacy institutions as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So, moving forward from here, what's another area? Like, you mentioned that you're working on some other things in education. Like, what are some other areas that we can look forward to in your reporting that you think are pertinent for fixing the education system? Because I'm biased, but like I think that all of our problems in America are going to get fixed with better education. I think that that's like the way through, because I'm a fan of information. I'm a fan of viewpoint diversity, civil discourse, and I think the more we bring that into education, then we can work out ideas, heal our divides, get rid of a lot of the partisanship that we have, have people be okay with being tested and challenged in their ideas. I love the term safe. I hate the term safe space, but I love it in terms of, is a safe space from judgment, not from having being
Hmm.
challenged, but from judgment. So just because you think differently than me doesn't mean you're a bad person, but I'm going to challenge you. And some people see that as the same thing. Like if you challenge my idea, then you're somehow attacking me. And we got to get rid of that, because it's just, that's not the way that best ideas come up. So
Hmm.
what else are you going to be working on in the future so we can follow your work and everything?
So right now, I've gotten a big kind of message from the audience that what they're really craving is kind of more solutions focused stories as well. Like, what are people doing right? Because I do, as a journalist, you tend to report a lot on what's going wrong. And so I have some stories that I'm working on now that focus on kind of innovations in policy in the classroom. Some districts, for example, in the most recent national data, some districts that you'd expect to be really struggling, districts with majority minority students, district with a lot of English language learners, or districts with a lot of low income students, some of them turn the tide and actually are improving on their rating scores, whereas in all the other districts in the country, they're lowering. So what is that district doing right that the other districts are missing? I'm going to start to try to investigate those answers. What are they doing right? What's working? And can that be replicated in the rest of the country? And what's holding other districts back from adopting those policies too? So that's going to be one of my big focuses
Oh,
moving
that's great.
forward, to give people some solution focused content as well. What's working?
Yeah, no, I think that's really important, because then I teach history, and it's like you learn from successes and failures of the past. So, oh,
Hmm.
that was bad. Let's not repeat that, and we always do, But like it's
Always.
that classic of, those who don't remember history are doomed to repeat it. But then you look at what worked in the past, and how do we do that? So I think that's really, really important. Like, who's doing something that works, and how can we bring that in to more more educational institutions and stuff. Like what let's and then we have, as we're talking about education more in this country, individual states, some are going to have more school choice, some are going to put their funding here, some are going to do this. And then we have little laboratories. It's the federalist system. We can look at these little laboratories and go, oh, it works here, this didn't work here. And then the best ideas, the things that get the best results, we can, try and scale. So
Totally. I mean, one trend I've been following is the micro schooling trend. I'm really fascinated by it because I do think in some ways you can view it as like a return to the old. It's like the one
yeah,
room schoolhouse coming back to life in modern America. And I'm really fascinated to see what happens with those schools. Are the kids going there getting better educational outcomes? Is it in some ways kind of an antidote to the culture war? I don't know. Let's follow it and see
yeah.
what happens.
I love that. Frannie Block, thank you so much. Where can people kind of follow your work? The Free Press, the FP.com, but also like where else can people just kind of follow up with what you're doing and keep in touch? You have like an X account and things like that.
Yes. Follow me on Twitter/X. It's at Frannie Block, FRANNIE BLOCK.
Okay. Beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you for what you're doing. It's really awesome to not be alone. I feel like for a lot of years I was like yelling like, what about K through 12? What about K through 12? I talked to a huge podcaster. I'm not gonna say his name, but it's like huge, one of the biggest podcasts on the planet. And I was like, how come we don't talk about K through 12? He's like, who cares? And this is like only like 4 years ago. I was like,
Well, I definitely care, Will. I
oh,
definitely care. I'm
I
with you.
know.
I think it's one of the most important stories that's not being told in America right now.
Well, thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for coming here and for everybody out there. Thank you for listening.